Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for December 10th, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today by John Markley, Matt Keyser, and John Hogoboom. I'm Brian Rexroad. And John Markley, let's go to you first. And of course, you know, we always enjoy a good impressionist, but I guess a certificate authority impression is not our desirable outcome.
Not a good thing at all. Yeah, this actually broke. I believe, like I said, on Saturday, but I saw the article today, so I don't know if it's hit a lot of news yet. But what we have a situation is that Google announced in a blog posting that they had identified this intermediate certificate authority had issued the certificate at a local agency, and the certificate authority is AMC out of France. But they issued this certificate, and the certificate actually was for some of the Google domains. Always a bad thing. I mean, you don't want to give a certificate for somebody else's domain because then it kind of lets people think that they're going to the site.
Right.
Yeah, we've had other intermediate certificate issues, authority issues in the past. It's one of those things I think that we have to consider. You know, we tell the users, we tell individuals, we say, you look for the little lock, look for the HTTPS. Here's a situation where you actually would have seen that lock. You would have seen everything looking clean going to a particular Google site, which is undisclosed. And you would have not necessarily recognized that, you really may not have been going to the proper site.
Right.
So it's just one of those things that, when you do perform transactions online, kind of keep an eye on the consequences afterwards. Make sure that it's really, those accounts are getting updated correctly, the information's getting there. This is we trust certificate authorities. I mean, that's the whole point of this. Mm-hmm. And when they make a mistake, it can be catastrophic.
So let me make sure I understand this correctly. Is there any evidence that these certificates were used in practice, or was it discovered before?
Some of the articles are indicating that there was a private mechanism on a network, on a local network, so not on the internet, not publicly available, but on a local network, mm-hmm. that the certificates were on those local devices that were being used to do some work there. My guess, probably testing or something of that nature, but you just don't know.
Okay, and it's my understanding that this has been revoked in Google Chrome. Do you know if any other browser vendors have done this as well? The information that's been released indicates that Google has contacted the other browser, the other majors, which would be Microsoft, and you go through the whole list, but Apple, whatever. They've been contacted. Nobody has come out and said, I'm revoking the certificate as well, but I would expect it to happen. We've seen some sort of major certificate issues. The industry is very sensitive to this type of thing, so I do expect this to be resolved very rapidly. All right, very good. All right, thank you for bringing that to our attention, John. I think it's one of these things that, we hear rumors of these sorts of things, but until you actually get some substantial evidence, that's really what I think drives it home in terms of making sure that we're addressing the types of threats that are actually, real concerns as opposed to ones that are essentially theoretical. And in the past, sometime in the past, many of these types of concerns were somewhat theoretical. Okay, so, we often have discussions about password compromises, and I think there was a story recently that's on a similar topic, and John Hogoboom, I guess maybe you can tell us a little more about this one.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brian. So there's a story that came out, I guess it was probably sometime last week, and a lot of people probably heard about it. I certainly heard about it in the media and whatnot. But the thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is about how I wasn't really happy with the way the media reported it, but let's talk about the facts here. So the reality of the situation is there's a large Pony-based botnet that was able to harvest around almost 2 million accounts, the logins and passwords for various websites such as Facebook and Twitter and Gmail and whatnot. This was reported by TrustWave from their labs. It's called Spider Labs, and we have the link there to the full article that you can read about. They actually talked about this particular botnet, I want to say either back in June or July of earlier this year. It wasn't quite as big then. It was probably about a quarter of the size that it is today. So it didn't get as much media coverage, but it's been around since, at least that time, and it's gotten a lot bigger over the past 6 or 7 months here. So one of the things I want to talk about is even myself, looking at how the media, mostly television, reported this. A lot of the taglines on these various reports were, say, 2 million Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter passwords stolen in a massive hack attack, 2 million Facebook, Twitter passwords stolen, hackers stole almost 1.6 million login credentials, blah, blah, blah. The thing I didn't like about the way this is phrased is we know there's been cases in the not-so-distant past where actual websites have been compromised and the account credentials have been stolen. To me, that's the way some of these read. But in reality, that's not what happened at all here. The websites were not hacked. The users were hacked. They were infected with malware. So unless you got infected with this malware, you wouldn't have had your account credentials stolen for any of the various websites.
Yeah, so I guess I just want to make sure that clarification came across. I may have interrupted you a little bit there, John, but in this case, there were no hacks against Facebook or Gmail or Twitter, and these, those were the ones that tended to get named because they were some of the bigger ones. I think there was even a financial services company named in this. Mm-hmm. They had no compromise whatsoever. It was actually the end users.
Right. It was the end users themselves who were compromised here. And one of the interesting findings of this report, which you can read, they have a couple of interesting observations. One of them was the poor password choices on many of the accounts, not all. When you really look at the total scope of how many accounts there are, it's not really terrible when you see that 15,000 out of 2 million had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as their password. It's a relatively low number, but still not a good password choice. A lot of these you can see. These are the top 10 passwords, very easily guessable. So obviously those people were not using good passwords. They have a little pie chart here that kind of shows, in the terrible or bad category, about 34%. So about a full third are not really good passwords. They'd probably be guessed anyway, even if they weren't stolen right off of the person's machine through brute force mechanisms and whatnot. So that was an interesting finding. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is, because a lot of people didn't report this really well, I just wanted to kind of mention what is Pony, because they do mention the Pony botnet. And Pony is not a single botnet. It's a lot, in a certain sense, we've talked about Zeus before, which is kind of a crimeware toolkit that people use to set up botnets. Pony, in a certain sense, is similar, but maybe even a lighter version of that. It's really just kind of a loader program that lets you administrate and maintain your bots in your botnet. So I kind of linked some description here, and this actually comes from SecureWorks, Dell SecureWorks, and they were talking about it in the context of Zeus Game Over. So one of the things, Pony is used a lot with the Zeus Game Over Trojan, as well as a bunch of other ones. So the bad guys running their botnet, they use Pony as the initial dropper program for maintenance and administration of their botnet, and then they'll have Pony download an additional component like the Zeus Game Over peer-to-peer component, and then that goes and does whatever it wants, but they'll use the Pony component to kind of keep track of all the machines that they have compromised. And it does a couple of other things too, such as, as soon as it gets on the machine, it mines the user's machine for the various websites they've gone to, email credentials, and login IDs and passwords. If you use the autosave feature, have your browser remember your password and whatnot, it goes and mines that information out of there. So I just want to make a quick mention of that and how that really works. So it's not a single botnet. It's kind of a toolkit. People can get it. And there's more than one botnet out there using this as part of their botnet infrastructure for maintenance and management of it. And then the last component here that I thought was interesting, there's a security researcher out here, Troy Hunt. I just give a little plug for his website that he kind of put together, which was kind of cute. It's haveibeenpwned.com. And Matt actually pointed this out to me, this website. This guy has put together a website that has a bunch of these various credential harvesting incidents that occurred. He's kind of compiled all the login IDs and emails for those various compromises. And you can put your email address in, and it'll tell you if you're on any of those lists. So if you've been compromised by any of those events that have occurred over. I'm not sure how far back he goes here, but certainly this one's in there, as well as probably some other ones that occurred this year.
Well, and I guess I was observing from the graphic you have there, he shows about 153, almost 154 million credentials that he's got at least some knowledge into the activity associated with that. Email address isn't specifically what he identifies there. So
right.
Nice collection.
Right.
It's got data from at least 5 different data breaches going back to 2010, actually. So if you remember the Gawker data breach happened a while back, right. That actually goes back to that one, and it's got some pretty big data sets here.
Right.
Okay. And that's about all I had on that one. I just wanted to kind of point out that this happened. You might have seen it in the news, and I just wanted to clarify that unless you actually had this malware, you wouldn't have had your account credentials stolen. Mm-hmm. Not to say that you might not have been compromised or gotten this malware and not know about it, but if you're a pretty safe user and you have good antivirus and you're making sure your machine doesn't get infected, chances are you're not going to be on, caught up in this account harvesting that went on as part of this activity.
Absolutely. And, of course, if you have the option, and oftentimes there are options for this nowadays, if you have the option of taking the two-factor authentication, that will help prevent misuse of, it'll at least help make your access more resilient. That is, compromising a single one-time password, for example, doesn't compromise your account permanently.
Right.
All right, very good. So let's stick with the password theme here. And John Markley, I guess sometimes passwords aren't just in the strength of the password themselves, but in the process to be able to manage those. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there was a researcher, Orrin Half, who's out of Israel. He used to work for a major auditing firm. I was trying to think of how to best categorize it. And I won't name them, but Orrin has did this work a few weeks back, actually, where he got a hold of Google and said, hey, and if you actually go to this website that's linked in the story here, there's a very detailed, very, very interesting description of how he identified that the Google password reset process is subject to some issues. It's been fixed, so, nobody panic right now. But this particular situation we all know that, you go to a website, you try to enter your password and you forget it, whatever happened. So then you turn around and you say, oh, I forgot my password, send it to me in email, text, whatever. What he was identifying is that the Gmail password reset that Google actually uses more than just Gmail put the scripting commands as well as some of the other instructions inside the URL. So if you just looked at the URL and you may have to dissect it a little bit, you could actually figure out some of the processes that were used by Google to reset these accounts. So he went through. I mean, it's a perfect storm, and that's how the story categorizes it. In that, by manipulating this data, by changing up some of the other functions, like he did, cross-site request forgery. He did cross-site scripting, SQL injection. There's a whole list of things that he produces in this expedition that he went on here. He actually was able to figure out a way to inject himself into a password reset, and like I said, you have to look at the story about how far he could get in, but it was pretty darn far. And, it's been fixed, but it does lend ourselves, back to this is something we've talked about for years and years and years, that you are, embedding those commands, those SQL commands and the URL, passwords and whatnot inside of the actual, URL header and the address bar list is not a good practice. And we have to be very cognizant, whenever we see that could be subject to some attack vectors.
Absolutely. So, the password reset process is one of many challenges, and this particular case sounds like it was really kind of entrenched in the technical details of it, but there are always little, sort of pitfalls, and there's a little bit of a relationship to this notion of password reset, similar to just in the physical world, identity proofing. There's been a number of cases where there's been controversy about, do you start with a social security number as your basis of having, some sort of an identity, and that's presumably, intended specifically for Social Security purposes, but yet it helps in terms of getting a driver's license, credit cards, things like that. So there are all kinds of little tricks that need to be considered that can be, ultimately fairly subtle and concerning things like resetting passwords, which is effectively that's the identifying information when you're on the internet.
And like I said, I just want to reemphasize is Google has fixed this, so that nobody should panic. But it
right.
certainly is a lesson here.
Yeah, and that's actually a good testimony. That they've even though this is as you described it, a fairly complex attack, it sounds like important enough to make sure that they made the corrections, and it sounds like they did the corrections rather quickly, which is a good thing. All right, very good. So and all these lines, there are password reset activities, and we always have to actually choose passwords as well. And so, Matt, it looks like you've come across a site that helps you choose passwords. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. This is a site that Microsoft Research put together. They call it TelepathWords, which sounds like you're speaking with a lisp, but it really isn't. I guess it means telepathic passwords, where the site will actually attempt to guess the next letter in the password that you type into the form. And the idea is to show users that it's very easy to predict, or at least for computers to figure out what the next letter in your password might be based on the first few. What they're doing is they're taking data from a number of public data breach sets, similar to the ones that Have I Been Pwned website we just talked about, as well as common phrases, and as well as the layout of the keyboard. So the ideas behind this are that people will sometimes use certain patterns on a keyboard, ASDF in order or something like that, or maybe they'll use a phrase that's very common, like the name of a city or the name of a person who's a public figure. And when you go to this website, you can start typing it in. For example, I typed in Washington, the state or the person, depending on what you prefer. And it'll show you, for each letter you type, it'll show 3 possibilities for what the next letter might be. And as you start typing it out, you can see that it'll do X's or check marks, depending on whether or not it was able to guess. And I believe the more checks that you get, the better, less predictable the password you've got.
Right.
Now, this is really sort of a tool to show people, who are used to using simple passwords that are predictable, that it's really not that hard for a computer to make educated guesses as to what the password might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very cool. And I think this is one of the more practical tools. I've seen cases in the past where you can go in and it'll generate a password for you that's completely gobbledygook. And obviously, gobbledygook is not only difficult to remember, but even can be very difficult to type. Whereas, having some sort of a phrase or, acronym or something along those lines, this is an opportunity to actually test something that might be familiar to you, you're comfortable with, and in terms of strength. And oftentimes, I found sites where it's asking for a password, and you put in something that says, nah, it doesn't like that password. But it never really gives you, I guess sometimes it gives you some guidance about what it doesn't like about it, but that doesn't really give you guidance in terms of how you could actually do some improvement to it. So I like this. This is pretty cool. Of course, you have to keep in mind that, you're typing in passwords here, so you have to trust the site where you pay.
Yeah, that's the second site on this one show that we've had people typing their passwords into. I'm fairly sure we can trust Microsoft Research, though. Fairly sure.
Absolutely.
One of the things I was just thinking out loud about in my head is, I know that somewhere back in my history, there had been some tools, and I think it was to do with LAN Manager trying to crack passwords, where it would only be able to crack maybe the first half of the password. Mm-hmm. Maybe I think it was maybe the first 8 characters or something. I was wondering how well it would work if you gave it the first 8 characters in one of those passwords that you're only able to get the first X number of characters, put it into this tool, and see what it gives you as options, if it's better at guessing what the rest of it would be. So anyway, I was just thinking that might be an interesting study to do on half passwords that you might have from other types of tool sets that crack things.
Guess we'll have to try.
Okay, so the next story here that I'm going to do is not to be taken too seriously. I'm going to don my tinfoil hat here, and this is actually a study that was done some time ago. This was actually picked up by Stan Nerlov. He shared this with us. He's been on this program a number of times, one of our analysts. And in this particular case, it's a study that was done by some MIT students that in the computer science department as well as the electrical engineering department back in 2005. It was an empirical study on the effectiveness of what they described as aluminum foil hats. We often refer to them as tin foil hats, but I guess they're more scientifically correct in calling it an aluminum foil hat. They actually tested a few different styles. We're showing a few different styles here, what they called the classical, which is very similar to what I'm wearing here, this sort of form-fitting aluminum foil hat, tin foil hat. They had one called the Fez. I'm not sure I really understand the significance behind that, but it was more of a cylindrical type. And the Centurion, which is more of a, sort of your warrior type hat with the high point and the top. And so let's take a little bit of a closer look at what they concluded here. I think this is actually not intuitive. It's actually kind of surprising to me, but now that, and this really gets into some of the nuances of antennas and electrical propagation properties. They actually found that there was an amplification effect at some frequencies, and two frequencies they picked out in particular were around 2.6 gigahertz, which is just a little bit above the Wi-Fi frequency band. I think this was allocated to satellite navigation. I might actually have that mixed up. I think that was actually associated with mobile telephony. And then there was a 20 dB amplification effect. And these are not insignificant levels. It is a 30 dB or 20 dB. That's a pretty significant increase in terms of amplification. This next one at 1.2 gigahertz, and that one I think is actually associated with satellite navigation. So, in particular, I'm not sure if that's actually the GPS band, but GPS actually transmits off the satellite's signals. And so, the notion behind this is actually, making sure that your brain waves aren't actually propagating out. I don't know that they did any study on what actual waves brains are using and whether they propagate outward. They did note that there was a marked 20 dB attenuation at around 1.5 gigahertz as well. The other point that's significant here is there was no significant attenuation beyond 10 dB anywhere else. And so, one of their sort of, and you have to, again, not take this too seriously, their conclusion was perhaps the helmet craze is actually something that was propagated by the government to help amplify certain frequencies of which they would have control of those frequencies and be able to get more information. Now, I had a colleague here that was considering this a little bit further. They thought that perhaps these folks had not studied enough types of tinfoil hats. And so I went digging around and looking for some others, and then actually came to some other conclusions about what the value of a tinfoil hat might be. So this first one here is actually one that kind of resembles sort of I'm going to call it that the Hershey Kiss tinfoil hat, and it may have some properties associated with it that could be better. I think, based on the study here, the fact that there were actually some attenuation properties would suggest perhaps that this is not a particularly good design. Now, this next one here, this guy seems to, on the upper right hand, he seems to understand the attenuation properties. In fact, he's done some things to exaggerate it a little bit more, and it sounds like he's actually trying to get some signals from let's say, outer space here. He's, it says, awaiting Zenu's orders, and so he perhaps is trying to amplify signals so that you'll be able to pick that up. Now, the next one here is actually one that has a bill on the front of the hat, and it looks like this has been formed over a baseball cap or something. I thought that was actually a pretty clever idea, that if you're, perhaps trying to, and I've actually I read this in some places, the closest exposure to your brain is actually through your eyes. You know, the rest of it has to go through a bony cranium, but your eyes actually have the optic nerves that connect directly into your eyes. And so if you're trying to protect yourself from satellite signals that might be propagating or out through your eyes or in through your eyes, then perhaps that bill would be a good protective measure. And last but not least here, we have this gentleman that apparently is protecting himself from lasers. And obviously something that would be laser. It looks like he has a laser gun here. It looks like it's disguised as an assault weapon, but I think that's a laser gun. And he's protecting his chest area as well as his hat. And in this case, the reflective properties, the optical reflective properties of a tinfoil hat would be actually kind of valuable. So anyway, that's those are some.
Hey, Brian, we may want to just say too that that tinfoil is not going to probably stop bullets, so bulletproof vest, not going to work well.
Yeah, well, it does look like he may have formed this over Kevlar, a Kevlar helmet and perhaps a Kevlar vest. So
we would hope, yes.
We hope he has. And in fact, if the laser were strong enough, perhaps it would have some melting properties of the aluminum itself. But certainly you might be able to, deflect that. And in fact, that could be a defensive in the fact that a laser reflecting off aluminum would present somewhat of a threat against the attacker in the first place. It could reflect him back and maybe perhaps blind him or something like that momentarily. So in any case, I thought these were some good, relatively impractical observations, and but I think I'm probably going to continue to don my tinfoil hat on various occasions. So on a more serious note, let's go ahead and take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. And the first one that I wanted to share with you is basically an alert or a surge in activity associated with scan probes on port 2345 TCP. This is associated with an application that is registered to an application called DBM. I'm assuming that refers to database management of some sort. I am not sure exactly what application is associated with that. And in this case, I'm not sure it really matters because as I was investigating this a little bit further, it turns out that this has many of the properties indicative of backscatter associated with a denial of service attack. The source address in this particular case was a single IP address in China. On different spikes of activity shown in the graph here, there were actually, in some cases, different addresses associated with that, but in each case it was a single address. And it appears, like I said, to be backscatter associated with a denial of service attack, the indicators being that the packets were SYN-ACK packets, that is, they would be indicative of a response from a server, and the source port, in this case, port 80 TCP. So that would be indicative of an attack against a website on port 80 and the web server attempting to respond to those. In this particular case, it appears that the attackers have simply elected, just for the sake of simplicity perhaps, to fix the source port in the attack at 12345 TCP. So perhaps a bit of a calling card from the attacker in this case. And we see this sort of type of event occurring from time to time where there are sort of a calling card of sorts associated with the attacker. The next one here is scam probes on port 5038 TCP. We've been reporting this for several weeks now. This is the asterisk voice over IP management port. And we continue to see spiky activity associated with scanning activity on this port. And invariably, the predominant probes are associated with a single IP address, but the IP addresses move from different sources over time. So in this particular case, most of these sources that we had identified over the last week or so have been single addresses servers that are located in the United States. So the graph has been updated. This has been a very consistent set of observations over the last several weeks that we've been reporting. Next one here is scan sources and scan probes on port 5666 TCP. This is associated with the Nagios application, and this is actually a network management application. I think it's a sort of an open source type application that's very popular in small data centers and small data, network management applications. And most of the sources in this particular case are basically associated with some smaller U.S.-based cloud providers. So I suspect what's happening here is there may be some weakness, maybe a password guessing attack or something against this particular application. They've managed to infect some small providers and are using that to search around and see if they can find other infection paths to help put together a botnet. This is somewhat concerning because there's a possibility here that they're able to get seize control or perhaps even get root access to servers in cloud service providers or hosting providers, and that could be used for, they may have a reasonable amount of bandwidth available to them for other types of attacks. So you want to pay some attention associated with this. This activity just started in volume over the last day or so. And the next item here, the last one in terms of activity on specific ports, scan sources on port 8081 TCP. This is registered to Sun Proxy Administration, Sun Proxy Admin. I don't think it's specifically associated with Sun at this point, but it is associated with sort of a proxy application. So in this case, most of the probes are from a single source, a single IP address in the United States. It is relatively, spiky in nature, although there was a sort of a period of time where there seemed to be some consistent scanning taking place. And one of the other observations is this particular source that was identified was observed previously scanning literally hundreds of different ports, pretty much almost all of the ports that you would identify as being used as low-number ports, that is up to port 1024 or so were associated with that range. As I said, hundreds of different ports being scanned by that single address. Now, in terms of the top 10 most probe ports, this activity from December 9th, yesterday, this is very consistent with what we had reported last week. First one, port 53 UDP, much of it associated with DNS reflection attacks, although the volume seems to have come down somewhat. Next is port 445. We still have that activity out there associated with configure infections. Port 123 UDP, this is network time protocol, and this is one that just showed up on the radar in the last couple of weeks. It appears that there's activity to use network time servers, NTP servers, in reflection attack activity. We see port 22 TCP, that's SSH, oftentimes associated with password guessing attacks. Port 80 TCP, obviously looking for web servers that might be exploitable, or perhaps underground web servers, that is ones that are not indexable through other means. And then we obviously have the peer-to-peer activity associated with the zero-access botnet, 16465, 16470, 16464, and 16471. And I have not seen a real significant discernible change in the activity in that, in terms of the zero-access peer-to-peer activity over the last week or so, which is a little contrary to what might be expected. We had been reporting significant increases in that activity. And last, I thought it would be helpful to show the daily reconnaissance index, and this is a case where, we'd like to see the daily reconnaissance index go down, contrary to what we'd like to see in the S&P 500, for example. But in this case, what we had been seeing over the last several weeks is sort of an upward trend, some spiky activity when it appeared to be some surges of activity associated with reflection attacks. But the good news is, over the last couple of weeks, it seems like it's at least leveled off and perhaps tailing downward a little bit. We'll keep an eye on that trend, and hopefully it will continue on the downward trajectory. That's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. You can also find us on Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq, and the ThreatTraq video is available in two places. First, on the AT&T Tech channel, that's att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube. And you can subscribe to an audio-only version of ThreatTraq through iTunes. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, John Markley, Matt Keyser, and John Hogoboom. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.